Lokesh arrives at his ancestral home in Varanasi, seeking refuge from the relentless noise of urban exhaustion. Through the meditative art of silk weaving and the quiet presence of Tripti, he begins to question his need for rigid structure and control. As he learns to synchronize his breath with the rhythm of the handloom, he discovers a stillness he never knew he was missing. Join Lokesh on a journey of slowing down and finding where he truly belongs. The echo of the shuttle. The rickshaw driver dropped Lokesh Varma in a cloud of ochre dust that tasted of diesel and dried night bloom scent. As the vehicle rattled away, the silence that rushed in was not a void, but a weight. Lokesh stood on the narrow alleyway, his ears still ringing with the phantom roar of the metropolis, the screech of subway brakes, the aggressive cadence of sirens, the relentless hum of a million air conditioners. He felt the vibration of the city still humming in his marrow, a residual frequency that made the stillness of Varanasi feel like a sudden drop in altitude. He shifted the strap of his leather messenger bag, the weight of his laptop and drafting tools pressing into his shoulder like a familiar burden. He stepped through the rusted iron gate of the ancestral home, and the world shifted. The courtyard was a basin of cool, damp air, smelling of wet lime plaster, and the heavy, cloying sweetness of incense that had soaked into the stone over decades. The light here was filtered, falling in slanted, dusty bars across a floor of weathered basalt. Lokesh paused, his feet feeling oddly light, as if the ground beneath him lacked the predictable rigidity of reinforced concrete. He looked up at the eaves, noting a slight sag in the timber beam of the veranda. His mind instinctively calculated the load-bearing capacity, the angle of the decay, and the necessary reinforcement required to bring it back to a true horizontal. He checked his watch. 4,112 p.m. He had arrived 3 minutes behind his projected schedule. His thumb began its rhythmic dance, rubbing against his index finger in a frantic, repetitive motion that he didn't consciously command. It was a tactile anchor, a way to quantify the passing seconds when the environment refused to provide a metric. He stood in the center of the courtyard, the silence pressing against his eardrums. It wasn't the peace he had sought in his brochures and emails, it was a vacuum that demanded to be filled. He felt a sudden, sharp vertigo, a physical instability born from the lack of momentum. In the city, he was a gear in a high-velocity machine. Here, he was a stationary object in a world that seemed to breathe in slow motion. Lokesh closed his eyes and began to construct a recovery schedule in the theater of his mind. He categorized his stay as a project, restoration of self. He envisioned a Gantt chart floating in the air. Week 1, detoxification and environmental assessment. Week 2, structural audit of the residence. Week 3, psychological baseline stabilization. He assigned KPIs to his relaxation, 3 hours of mindful breathing per day, a 20% reduction in cortisol levels, and the successful identification of all structural failures in the house. He treated the vacation as a series of deliverables, a technical problem to be solved with the same precision he used to design skyscrapers. If he could just map the chaos, he could control it. He wandered into the main hall, where the air was cooler and smelled of old paper and cedar. On a heavy mahogany side table, a stack of yellowed blueprints lay curled like dried leaves. Lokesh stopped, his gaze locking onto the technical drawings of the house from 40 years ago. He pulled a mechanical pencil from his pocket, the click of the lead extending, sounding like a gunshot in the quiet. He leaned over the table, his eyes narrowing. The margins were imprecise. The scale was slightly off in the eastern wing, and the drafting of the drainage system was an affront to modern hydraulic standards. He began to correct the lines. He didn't just mark the errors, he redrew the sections with a surgical intensity, his hand moving in a blur of graphite. He found himself obsessing over a 2-millimeter discrepancy in the hallway's width, his breath becoming shallow. He was no longer in Varanasi. He was back in the office, fighting a deadline, correcting a junior architect's sloppiness. He was so deep in the geometry of the hallway, so consumed by the need to force the old paper into a modern symmetry, that he failed to hear the soft scuff of sandals on the stone floor behind him. He missed the arrival of Amkar, the very reason for his journey, because he was too busy fixing a ghost of a building. Then it happened. A sound sliced through the internal noise of his calculations. It was a rhythmic, heavy thrum, a metal-sharp clack-clack, followed by a sliding shush. It was deep, percussive, and steady, echoing through the courtyard like a giant wooden heartbeat. Lokesh froze, his pencil hovering over a corrected line. The sound was not mechanical in the way he understood it. It lacked the whine of a motor or the hiss of hydraulics. It was organic, a cadence of human effort and wooden friction. It felt invasive, yet hypnotic, pulling his attention away from the blueprints and toward the rear of the house. He followed the sound, his footsteps echoing on the basalt. He moved through a narrow corridor where the walls were draped in heavy, indigo-dyed fabrics that dampened the sound of his breathing. The air grew warmer here, smelling of raw silk and something earthy, like crushed marigolds and wet clay. He reached the end of the hall and found a heavy teak door standing slightly ajar. He had been told the weaving rooms were locked during the midday heat, but this one was open, a sliver of golden light spilling onto the floor. Lokesh leaned in, his thumb again rubbing his finger. He didn't enter, but he zoomed in on the scene through the gap. Inside, the room was a cathedral of threads. Thousands of warp threads stretched across the loom like the strings of a massive, silent harp, shimmering in a gradient of saffron and deep crimson. The shuttle flew, a blur of polished wood, zipping from left to right with a precision that made his engineering heart skip. He focused on the movement of the weaver's hands. They didn't move with the frantic efficiency of a factory worker. They moved with a deliberate, prayer-like grace. The rhythm was absolute, but it wasn't hurried. Every throw of the shuttle was followed by a beat of silence, a silence that seemed to exist outside of time. He watched a single thread of gold zari be woven into the silk, the metal-sharp glint catching the light. For the first time in a decade, Lokesh forgot to check his watch. He forgot the KPIs and the Gantt charts. He simply watched the shuttle move, feeling a strange, terrifying sensation in his chest, the feeling of being completely, utterly irrelevant to the process of the world. As he stared, the weaver paused. The sudden cessation of the clack-clack felt like a physical blow. Lokesh recoiled, pulling back from the door, his heart suddenly hammering against his ribs. He felt as though he had intruded upon a private conversation between the wood and the silk. He turned to retreat, but as he did, he realized he had left his pencil on the blueprints in the other room. He stood there in the dim corridor, caught between the urge to organize his life and the sudden, overwhelming desire to simply listen to the silence that followed the loom. Oh, steam and soul. The tea arrived not as a beverage, but as a ceremony of patience. Omkar moved with a deliberation that felt almost provocative, his hand steady as he poured the masala chai from a blackened brass pot. The liquid descended in a thin, unbroken ribbon, a pale ochre stream that spiraled into the chipped ceramic cups. Steam curled upward in slow, lazy ribbons, catching the light of the courtyard and hanging in the humid air like ghosts. Lokesh watched the process, his thumb rubbing his index finger with a rhythmic, insistent friction. He felt the pressure of the clock ticking in the back of his skull, a phantom digital display counting down the seconds of a day that was already half spent on silence and shadows. "The ginger's fresh from the market," Omkar said, his voice a low-frequency hum that seemed to vibrate in the very floorboards beneath them. He didn't look up as he set the cup down. He placed it exactly in the center of the rough-hewn wooden table, a piece of furniture that looked as though it had grown out of the earth rather than been built by hand. Lokesh didn't touch the tea. He cleared his throat, the sound sharp and sterile against the ambient hum of the house. "Uncle, I appreciate the welcome, truly. But I've had a chance to walk the perimeter, and the subsidence in the East Wing is more significant than the photos suggested. If we can sit down and map out a preliminary timeline, say a phased approach over 12 weeks, we can minimize the risk of further structural degradation. I can draft a Gantt chart by tomorrow morning if we can agree on the primary milestones." Omkar didn't answer immediately. He sat back, his hands resting flat on his thighs, his palms open. He blinked slowly, a movement so gradual it felt like a shutter closing on a camera. He looked not at Lokesh, but at the way the steam from the tea was drifting toward the ceiling. "Do you smell it?" Omkar asked. Lokesh paused, his mouth still slightly open from the word milestones. "Smell what?" "The river," Omkar whispered. "It isn't just in the air, it's in the walls. The limestone has spent 100 years drinking the humidity of the Ganga. The house is saturated with the scent of silt and old prayers. Can you smell the water in the brick?" Lokesh felt a sudden, sharp spike of irritation. He adjusted his glasses, pushing the bridge up with a precise, flicking motion of his finger. This was the friction he had feared, the drift from the tangible to the ethereal. He shifted in his seat, the wooden chair creaking under him, a sound that felt like a protest. He wanted a spreadsheet, he was being offered a poem. He wanted a structural survey, he was being asked to sniff the masonry. "This is exactly why I left," Lokesh thought, the internal monologue rising like a tide. "The lack of linearity. The way time here isn't a sequence of events but a pool of stagnant water. I am an engineer. I deal in loads, stresses, and shear forces. I deal in the immutable laws of gravity and material fatigue. I cannot restore a house based on the scent of the river. If the foundation is compromised, no amount of atmospheric appreciation will stop the roof from collapsing on our heads. I am drowning in this softness, and he is just watching me sink with a smile. With all due respect, Uncle, Lokesh said, his voice measured and clipped, the tone he used for junior associates who missed a deadline. Structural integrity is a matter of physics, not spirituality. The capillary action of groundwater into the porous brickwork is a chemical process, efflorescence, not a spiritual saturation. We are dealing with salt crystallization and hydrostatic pressure. These are problems that require a technical intervention, a moisture barrier, and a rigid schedule of reinforcement. They don't require listening. Omkar remained still. He didn't argue, didn't frown, and didn't defend his position. He simply let the silence stretch. It was a heavy, oppressive silence that began to eat away at Lokesh's composure. In the city, silence was a void to be filled with a phone call or a notification. Here, the silence was an active participant in the conversation. Lokesh felt his restlessness manifesting as a physical itch under his skin. He watched the tea, now cooling, a thin film beginning to form on the surface. He realized he was the only one in the courtyard who was hurried, and the realization made him feel absurdly small, like a frantic insect buzzing around a mountain. After a full minute of this stillness, Omkar finally moved. He stood up, the movement fluid and unhurried, and gestured toward the inner sanctum of the house. The hallway led into a darkened area where the plaster was peeling away in long, curling strips, revealing the raw, red brick beneath. The walls were scarred with damp patches that looked like Rorschach blots, dark and weeping in the dim light. "You see a failure of materials," Omkar said, his voice resonating in the narrow space. "You see a problem to be solved with a barrier and a timeline. But you are treating this house as if it were a machine that has broken down. This house is not a machine, Lokesh. It is a body. It has a soul, and that soul is currently in a state of profound grief. It resists change because it has forgotten how to trust the hands that touch it." Lokesh stepped forward, his shoes clicking on the basalt floor. He reached out to touch a patch of peeling plaster, his fingers grazing the gritty surface. "Grief is not a structural variable, Uncle. It doesn't affect the load-bearing capacity of a column." "And yet," Omkar replied, turning to look Lokesh in the eye, "if you force the repair, if you impose your will upon the stone without understanding its rhythm, the house will reject you. The structure will fight the reinforcement. You will find that the more you tighten the bolts, the more the walls will crack. The house is speaking right now, Lokesh. It is telling you that it is tired, that it is afraid of being erased." Omkar leaned in slightly, the scent of cardamom and old paper clinging to him. "If you cannot learn to listen to the house, you will remain a stranger here. You will be just another contractor coming to strip the skin off a living thing." Lokesh pulled his hand back from the wall as if the brick had burned him. He studied the peeling plaster, then at his uncle's serene, unwavering expression. For the first time, he felt a flicker of genuine doubt. He thought of the loom in the other room, the hypnotic, prayer-like precision of the weaver. He realized that he didn't know how to listen to anything that didn't provide a data point. As Omkar turned to walk back toward the courtyard, leaving Lokesh alone in the dim hallway, Lokesh noticed something on the floor. Half buried in a drift of fallen plaster was a small, rusted iron key, its bow shaped like a lotus. He stared at it for a moment, then looked up at the ceiling. Above him, in the depths of the house, there was a sudden, sharp creak. Not the sound of settling wood, but a deliberate, rhythmic groan, as if the house were sighing in its sleep. Odd room. Wahid Qureshi did not walk into the house so much as he merged with it, arriving in a cloud of fine white limestone dust that clung to his cotton kurta like a second skin. He stopped in the center of the courtyard, crossing his arms loosely across his chest, and surveyed Lokesh with a slow, knowing smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He looked less like a mason and more like a man who had spent 40 years studying the slow migration of shadows across a wall. His presence was heavy, grounding, and entirely unimpressed by the sleek, brushed aluminum casing of the tablet Lokesh held in his grip. "I have the preliminary structural analysis ready," Lokesh said, his voice measured, though he found himself rubbing his thumb against his index finger in a quick, rhythmic motion. He stepped forward and angled the screen toward Wahid, presenting a high-resolution 3D render of the house. The image was a clinical ghost, a wireframe model of optimized load paths, color-coded for stress points, with a revised floor plan that streamlined the circulation of air and light. If we reinforce the eastern wing with a carbon fiber wrap and replace the rotting joists with treated steel, we can extend the lifespan of the structure by another 80 years. I've mapped the exact points of failure. Wahid didn't look at the screen. He didn't even glance at the glowing pixels. Instead, he tilted his head, listening to the distant, rhythmic thrum of the loom from the inner courtyard, then looked at the peeling lime wash of the ceiling. "You have brought a map of a city that does not exist, Lokesh," Wahid said, his voice a rough hum. "You are showing me the skeleton, but you have forgotten that the house has skin. You are trying to cure a fever by rearranging the bones." Without waiting for a response, Wahid turned and led Lokesh deeper into the house, his footsteps soft on the basalt. He stopped abruptly in a narrow corridor where the light filtered through a high, narrow vent in thick, golden shafts. He pointed to a hairline fracture that spider-webbed across the wall, a jagged vein of gray cutting through the pale ochre plaster. Lokesh leaned in, his glasses slipping slightly down his nose. He could see the precise angle of the shear. It was a textbook example of settling tension. "A polymer injection," Lokesh said immediately, his mind already calculating the viscosity of the resin. "We can inject a high-strength epoxy into the fissure. It will bond the masonry and stop the crack from propagating. It's a 5-minute fix that ensures the wall remains monolithic." Wahid let out a rough, sudden laugh that echoed in the narrow space. He stepped closer, the scent of wet earth and old stone radiating from him. "And then you would suffocate the room," Wahid said, his voice dropping an octave. "This crack is not a failure, Lokesh. It is a lung. The house breathes through these fissures. In the monsoon, the walls swell. In the heat of May, they contract. If you plug the pores of the stone with your plastic glue, the pressure will not vanish. It will simply move. You will stop this crack only to create 10 more in the foundation. You cannot fight the breath of the house." Lokesh felt a surge of irritation, a tightening in his chest that usually preceded a long night of revisions. "Breath is not a structural property, Wahid. Safety codes are not suggestions. If the tensile strength of the wall is compromised, the risk of partial collapse increases. I cannot sign off on a restoration that relies on the breathing of a wall." He shifted his weight, his shoes clicking sharply against the stone, a stark contrast to Wahid's silent, rooted presence. "Why is every conversation here a riddle?" Lokesh wondered. "I am speaking the language of physics, of gravity, of verifiable constants. I am offering a solution that is mathematically sound, yet he looks at me as if I am trying to repair a painting by scrubbing it with soap. Is it arrogance, or is it a genuine blindness on my part? In the city, a crack is a warning. Here, it is a conversation. I feel as though I am standing on the edge of a cliff, and the only person who knows the way back is insisting that I simply jump and trust the air to hold me." He leaned back against the wall, the cold stone pressing through his shirt, intending to cross his arms and wait for Wahid to acknowledge the logic of the epoxy. But as he shifted, his shoulder caught a wooden panel that looked like part of the wainscoting. There was a soft, mechanical click, a sound of precision that felt out of place in the organic decay of the hallway. The panel didn't just move, it recessed, sliding backward with a smoothness that suggested it had been oiled recently. Lokesh lost his balance, stumbling backward into a space that hadn't existed a second ago. He landed on his feet in a small, circular room that felt like the heart of a clock. It was sun-drenched, illuminated by a series of hidden skylights that cast perfect overlapping circles of light onto the floor. The air here was different, thick, heavy, and saturated with the ancient, creamy scent of sandalwood. It was a smell that felt gold and amber, a fragrance so dense it almost tasted of resin and old honey. The silence in the room was absolute, a vacuum that swallowed the noise of the city outside. Lokesh stood still, his heart slowing as the scent washed over him. On the floor, resting on a low wooden plinth, lay a piece of yellowed parchment. He knelt beside it, his fingers trembling slightly. It was a hand-drawn map of the house, but as he studied the lines, his engineering instincts recoiled. The walls weren't drawn as straight lines or right angles. The ink flowed in curves and swells, the boundaries of the rooms shifting and undulating. There were no measurements, no scales, no north arrow. Instead, the map was annotated with the movement of the sun. The lines followed the trajectory of light across the floors at different times of the year. He reached out to touch the parchment, his mind already attempting to correct the geometry, to translate these fluid shapes into something Euclidean and usable. He wanted to overlay this onto his 3D model, to find the error in the drawing. But as his finger brushed the bottom corner of the page, he saw a date written in a fading, elegant script. It was a date from 70 years ago, accompanying a label for this specific room, the Chamber of Stillness. Lokesh looked up at the walls around him. He studied the skylights and the way the sandalwood scent seemed to cling to the very air. He opened his tablet and scrolled through the official blueprints he had inherited from the family archives. He scrolled through the site surveys and the structural audits. There was no circular room. There was no hidden corridor. According to every piece of data he possessed, he was currently standing inside a solid block of masonry. While he'd appeared in the doorway, his silhouette framing the narrow opening. He didn't look surprised. He simply leaned against the frame, his knowing smile returning. The house does not give up its secrets to those who only look at screens, Lokesh. It waits for the moment you stop trying to control it and simply lean against it. Lokesh looked from the impossible map to the man in the doorway, the lotus-shaped key still heavy and cold in his pocket. He realized with a jolt of vertigo that the house was not a puzzle to be solved, but a living thing that had just invited him inside. The spectrum of silk. The clatter hit Lokesh before the sight of the room did, a percussive, hypnotic wall of sound that felt less like noise and more like a heartbeat. It was the rhythmic thwack-slide of a dozen handlooms operating in unison, a mechanical symphony that seemed to vibrate in the very marrow of his bones. He stepped over the threshold of the workshop, his boots clicking on the cool stone floor, and for a moment, the sheer sensory density of the space stalled his breath. He had come here seeking the source of the house's hidden geometries, but he found instead a cathedral of color. Silk draped from the ceiling in long, shimmering waterfalls, cutting through the dusty shafts of afternoon light. There were deep ochres that looked like captured sunsets, river blues that shifted from navy to cerulean as he moved, and golds so bright they seemed to emit their own warmth. The threads didn't just hang, they breathed, swaying slightly in a cross breeze that carried the scent of damp earth and boiled minerals. Lokesh stood frozen, his eyes darting from one spool to another, his mind instinctively trying to categorize the spectrum, to map the coordinates of the dyes, but the sheer volume of pigment overwhelmed his internal filing system. "You carry the city in your shoulders," a voice said, drifting through the clatter like a distant flute. Lokesh jumped, his glasses sliding down the bridge of his nose. He turned to find a woman emerging from behind a massive teak loom. She was slight, her presence almost translucent against the vivid backdrop of the silks, wearing a simple cotton apron stained with splashes of indigo and madder root. She didn't approach him directly. Instead, she stopped a few feet away, tilting her head slightly, as if listening to a frequency Lokesh couldn't hear. Her eyes were calm, observing him with a curiosity that felt clinical yet kind. "I'm Lokesh," he started, his voice sounding thin against the percussive backdrop. He instinctively shifted his weight, his thumb beginning its rhythmic, anxious rub against his index finger. "I'm the nephew of Omkar. I'm a structural engineer, and I've been working on the restoration of the ancestral home. I was told that the weaving traditions here are intertwined with the house's history, and I wanted to understand the spatial requirements of the looms, how the weight of the machinery affects the floor joists, and—" Tripti didn't answer. She didn't even seem to be processing the words. She simply tilted her head further, her gaze drifting past him to the looms, then back to his hands. She watched the thumb rubbing for a long beat of silence, the thwack slide of the shuttles filling the gap. Lokesh stopped mid-sentence, the sudden lack of verbal feedback leaving him adrift. He felt an unfamiliar prickle of vulnerability, as if she were reading a blueprint of his anxiety that he hadn't yet learned how to hide. "City tension," she said softly, her voice barely rising above the mechanical hum. "You speak of joists and weights, but you are vibrating like a plucked string. Why has a man with such tight shoulders come to a place of flow?" Lokesh frowned, his hand dropping to his side. "I don't understand. I'm just trying to ensure the structural integrity of the workshop. If the house is shifting, which the map suggests it is, the looms could be at risk. I need to establish a baseline for the load-bearing capacity of this wing." Tripti let out a small, airy laugh that didn't reach the point of mockery, but rather sounded like a gentle correction. She stepped closer, and Lokesh noticed the way she moved, not in a straight line, but in a fluid, undulating path that mirrored the curves of the map he had found in the Chamber of Stillness. She studied the looms not as machines, but as partners. He noticed a small, hand-carved wooden wedge resting on a nearby table, shaped like a lotus petal, mirroring the key in his pocket. The repetition of the symbol felt like a quiet warning. The logic of this house was not written in mathematics, but in symbols. Without warning, she reached out and took a heavy spool of raw silk from a nearby rack. It was a deep, visceral crimson, the color of pomegranate seeds. She didn't hand it to him casually. She placed it firmly in his palms, the weight of the silk forcing his hands to drop and his fingers display open. "Hold this," she commanded gently. "Do not analyze it. Do not calculate its mass. Just hold it." Lokesh froze. The silk was cool, surprisingly heavy, and possessed a texture that was simultaneously rough and slippery. The physical weight of the spool acted as an anchor, pulling his focus away from the mental checklist of structural audits and Gantt charts. For the first time since he had arrived in Varanasi, the noise in his head, the constant humming of deadlines and tolerances, began to fade. The sensory input was too immediate, too concrete to be ignored. He felt the grain of the wood at the core of the spool and the tension of the wound threads against his skin. He looked up and found himself staring at Tripti's hands. They were steady, the skin stained with a permanent patina of mineral dyes, deep purples under the nails, amber streaks across the knuckles. They were the hands of a person who didn't just observe the world, but collided with it. He felt a sudden, sharp spike of curiosity, a desire to know how a human hand could coax such vibrant life out of raw minerals and worms. It was a different kind of engineering, not the prevention of collapse, but the creation of beauty. "The silk is waiting for you, Lokesh," Tripti whispered, her voice now closer, almost a secret shared between them. She leaned in, her eyes locking onto his. "But be careful. The loom is a jealous master. It only accepts those who have stopped counting the minutes." Lokesh tried to formulate a response, something about the efficiency of time management or the necessity of scheduling, but the words died in his throat. He was still holding the crimson spool, and he realized with a start that he didn't want to put it down. The weight was grounding him, pinning him to the present moment in a way that no blueprint ever could. As she turned back to her loom, the rhythmic thwack slide seemed to change pitch, shifting from a noise to a melody. Lokesh looked around the room again, and this time he didn't see a series of load-bearing challenges. He saw the way the silk caught the light, the way the dust danced in the air, and the way the walls seemed to pulse in time with the weaving. In the corner of the room he spotted a stack of old journals, their spines cracked and faded, resting on a shelf that dipped slightly under their weight. They were positioned exactly where the map indicated a shift in the house's axis, a physical manifestation of the anomaly he had discovered. He remained there for a long time, the crimson silk heavy in his hands, watching Tripti move through the spectrum of color. He felt a strange creeping sensation that the house wasn't just inviting him in, it was beginning to rewrite him. He had come to fix the house, but as he stood in the heart of the clatter, he wondered if the house was actually fixing him. The breath of the loom. The shuttle felt like a foreign object in his hand, a piece of polished hardwood that refused to obey the laws of leverage Lokesh had spent a decade mastering. He gripped it with laboratory precision, knuckles white, calculating the trajectory. He wasn't just throwing wood across a warp of silk, he was solving a geometric puzzle. Visualizing the entry angle and the arc of flight, he launched it with a clinical flick of the wrist. A violent snap echoed through the room like a gunshot. The shuttle didn't glide. It jolted, snagging a stray thread and ripping through the tension of the warp. Lokesh froze, staring at the severed strand of crimson silk curling like a dying nerve against the frame. A hot flush of frustration climbed his neck. It was a simple mechanical action. The physics were elementary. Why was the machine rejecting him? "You are treating the loom as an adversary, Lokesh," Tripti said. She hadn't moved, but her voice drifted around him like a scent. He could feel the warmth of her presence, a grounding force against the electric agitation humming in his nerves. He didn't turn, he couldn't take his eyes off the broken thread. "It's a matter of adjustment," Lokesh replied, his voice tight. He adjusted his glasses with a jerky motion. "The tension on the warp must be uneven, or the shuttle's center of gravity is off. If I find the right angle of release, the friction will decrease." Tripti let out a soft humming sound, not a laugh, but a gentle acknowledgement of his absurdity. She stepped closer, her hand hovering inches from his shoulder. "You are trying to engineer a conversation in a language you don't speak. You are fighting the machine, trying to force it into submission. But the loom is not a tool to be mastered. It is a partner to dance with. You cannot command the silk, you must invite it to move." Lokesh rubbed his thumb against his index finger in an anxious rhythm. "I don't dance, Tripti. I build things that stay where they are put. I believe in tolerances and load-bearing capacities. I don't understand how thread requires a dance." "That is why the thread broke," she whispered. "You were holding your breath. You were holding your entire life in your jaw. Look at your shoulders, they are nearly touching your ears. You are a statue of tension trying to create something fluid." Lokesh exhaled a jagged breath. He studied the heavy timber frame, smelling of old oil and beeswax, and felt an overwhelming desire to be competent. He hated being the novice, the weakest link in a structural chain. he decided to apply his technical mind to his own biology. He would engineer his breathing. Closing his eyes, he began to count. 1, 2, 3, 4. Inhale. 1, 2, 3, 4. Exhale. He visualized oxygen entering his bloodstream as calculated inputs, attempting to force his heart rate down through sheer willpower. "Stop counting," Tripti said, as if she could hear the numbers. "You're just replacing one set of blueprints with another. Forget the numbers. Listen to the house. Listen to the beat of the reed. The loom has its own pulse, Lokesh. If you don't find that rhythm, you will only keep breaking the silk." Lokesh let his hands drop. The silence of the room rushed back, layered with the muffled sounds of Varanasi, the chime of a temple bell, the cry of a vendor, the low hum of the city's eternal motion. He closed his eyes again, but this time he didn't count. He stopped managing the moment and simply existed within it. He listened to the rhythmic thwack slide of Tripti's own loom nearby, a steady percussion that synchronized with the slow sigh of the ancestral house. He felt the air move in his lungs as a natural response to the space around him. The tension in his jaw dissolved, his shoulders dropped. He felt a strange floating sensation, as if the boundaries between his skin and the humid air were blurring. He reached for the shuttle again, not with a grip of control, but with a light, open touch. He didn't calculate the angle. He simply waited for the rhythm of the room to open a door. He threw the shuttle. It didn't snap. The wood glided across the warp with a singing hiss, sliding through the threads like a needle through water. It landed softly in the opposite side, a perfect, effortless transition. A wave of calm washed over him, a mental stillness so profound it felt like a physical weight lifting off his chest. He had stopped thinking about the result and had become part of the process. "Now, look," Tripti said. Lokesh leaned forward, peering at the fabric. He expected a uniform strip of crimson, a specimen of industrial consistency. Instead, he saw a map of his own instability. The first few inches were a disaster. The weave was knotted, jagged and tight, the threads pulled into stressed clumps like scars. The fabric there was stiff. But toward the most recent row, the texture changed. The silk became fluid, the line smooth, the color deepening into a rich, consistent glow. He touched the jagged knots. They felt brittle. He realized with a jolt of clarity that these weren't just errors in technique, they were the physical manifestations of his anxiety and his need for control, frozen in silk. He had spent his life building walls to prevent collapse, and here was the evidence of the collapse happening inside him. "The loom does not lie," Tripti murmured. "It records everything. Your anger, your doubt, your peace. It is a mirror made of thread." Lokesh stared at the knots, his thumb tracing the rough edge of a tension break. For the first time since returning to Varanasi, he didn't want to fix the error. He wanted to keep them, as a reminder of the man who had entered the room and the man who was beginning to breathe. As he sat in the deepening amber light of the afternoon, Lokesh noticed something peculiar. On the dipping shelf where the old journals rested, a thin layer of dust had been disturbed, as if something or someone had recently moved the books. He looked back at the map he had found earlier, then at the anomalous axis of the room. The house was shifting, not structurally but spiritually, and as he studied the jagged silk in his hands, he wondered what other hidden truths were woven into the very walls of the home he had come to save. Mineral and Moonlight. Lokesh reached for the first journal, his fingers hovering just above the leather binding, when the light in the workshop shifted. The amber glow of the afternoon deepened, catching the suspended dust motes and transforming them into shards of floating gold leaf that swirled in the wake of his movement. He didn't touch the book. Instead, he stared at the gap in the dust, a clean swipe of mahogany wood that suggested someone had been here, someone who moved with a purpose that left no trace but a void. He rubbed his thumb against his index finger, the rhythmic friction a small anchor against the sudden, irrational feeling that the house was watching him back. "The journals will still be there tomorrow, Lokesh," Tripti said, her voice drifting through the room like a distant flute. He jumped, his glasses sliding down the bridge of his nose. She was standing in the doorway, leaning against the frame with a softness that seemed to absorb the noise of the city outside. She didn't ask why he was hovering over the shelf. She simply tilted her head, observing the tension in his shoulders. The measured, clipped cadence of the engineer wanted to ask who else had access to the room, to demand a log of entries, to map the trajectory of the intruder. But as he watched her, the urgency felt misplaced, like trying to use a blueprint to understand a song. "Come," she said, stepping aside. "The light is turning. If we miss the window, the minerals will settle, and the color will be lost." She led him away from the mystery of the journals and through a narrow corridor that smelled of damp stone and old incense. They emerged into a back courtyard that felt like a secret kept from the rest of Varanasi. Here, the air was heavier, thick with the scent of sulfur and wet earth. A series of terracotta pots, wide-mouthed and stained with centuries of use, simmered over low charcoal fires. The steam rose in lazy curls, blurring the edges of the courtyard walls, making the space feel infinite and enclosed all at once. Tripti stopped beside a vat of deep, iridescent blue. It wasn't the flat blue of a chemical dye, it was a living thing, swirling with hints of violet and charcoal, shimmering like the surface of a deep lake under a storm. She dipped a wooden stirring rod into the liquid, lifting it to let a thick, viscous bead of pigment drip slowly back into the pot. "These are river mineral dyes," she explained, her voice airy and light. "We collect the sediment from specific bends in the Ganges where the current slows and the minerals settle into the silt. It is a chemistry of patience." Lokesh leaned in, his engineering mind instinctively beginning to categorize. He thought of pH levels, mineral oxidation, and the saturation points of organic compounds. He opened his mouth to ask about the composition of the silt, perhaps the iron content or the presence of cobalt, but the words died in his throat. He watched the way the blue light reflected in Tripti's eyes, and for the first time in a decade he found he didn't want the formula, he only wanted the color. He felt a strange, humming vibration in his chest, a resonance that matched the low thrum of the city beyond the walls. "It changes," Tripti murmured, noticing his silence. "The blue is never the same twice. It depends on the river's mood, the monsoon rains, the amount of silt carried from the mountains, the temperature of the water. You cannot force a shade. You can only invite it." Lokesh looked at the terracotta pots, then at his own hands, which had spent years clutching calipers and drafting pens. He had lived his life believing that if you measured a thing accurately enough, you could control it. But here, in this humid sanctuary, the idea of control seemed absurd, almost vulgar. He shifted his weight, feeling the rough grit of the courtyard floor beneath his sandals, and realized he had stopped calculating the time. The internal clock that usually ticked toward the next milestone had gone quiet. They sat together on a low stone bench, the heat from the charcoal fires warming their skin. A long silence settled between them. In the city, silence was usually a void to be filled, a gap in communication that signaled awkwardness or disagreement. But this silence felt structural, like a well-placed beam that held up the weight of the afternoon. Lokesh didn't feel the urge to plan, to suggest a timeline for the restoration, or to analyze the efficiency of the dye process. He simply breathed, the scent of sulfur and sandalwood filling his lungs, watching the gold-leaf dust dance in the fading light. Tripti reached up and lightly brushed a stray thread of crimson silk off her apron. She didn't look at him immediately. She kept her gaze on the simmering vats. "I rarely let anyone into the dye room," she said softly. "Most people find the smell offensive, or they try to tell me how to stabilize the pigments with synthetic fixatives." Lokesh realized that when he spoke, his voice had changed. The sharp, clipped edges of the project manager were gone, replaced by a softness he didn't recognize. "I think," he began, pausing to find the right word, "that the instability is the point. If it were stable, it would be a product, not a reflection." Tripti turned to him, her expression unreadable, but not unkind. "And you, Lokesh? Do you find the instability frightening?" He thought of the jagged knots in the silk he had woven earlier, the physical map of his own anxiety. He thought of the anomalous axis of the house and the disturbed dust on the journals. He felt a flicker of the old panic, the need to categorize the unknown, but he pushed it down, letting it dissolve into the warmth of the courtyard. "I'm starting to think," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "that I've spent too much time trying to build things that can't move." "Solitude is where the most honest colors are found," Tripti replied. "When you stop trying to project what you want the world to be, you finally see what it actually is." As the sun dipped below the horizon, the amber light vanished, replaced by a cool, ethereal silver. The moon rose over the jagged skyline of the city, casting long, pale shadows across the courtyard. Tripti stood and walked toward the furthest corner of the space, where a single, smaller vat was covered with a heavy linen cloth. With a slow, deliberate motion, she pulled the cloth away. Inside was a liquid that defied Lokesh's understanding of color. It was a shimmering, translucent silver, almost liquid moonlight, pulsing with a faint inner luminescence that seemed to breathe in time with the wind. It didn't reflect the light, it seemed to generate its own. "The moon." "Silt," Tripti whispered. "It can only be achieved during the window of the festival, when the river's alignment and the lunar pull create a suspension of minerals." It is the most fragile color of all. Lokesh stared into the silver depths, mesmerized. He felt a sudden, sharp pull of curiosity. Not the technical curiosity of an engineer, but the hunger of a man who had found a door he didn't know existed. As he studied the silver pigment, he remembered the lotus-shaped key in his pocket and the journals on the shelf. The house was no longer a project to be managed. It was a riddle to be lived. Just as he reached out to touch the edge of the vat, a heavy footstep sounded in the corridor behind them, followed by the low, rhythmic clearing of a throat. Lokesh turned to see Uncle Omkar standing in the shadows, his face partially obscured, holding a single, flickering oil lamp. He wasn't smiling. In his hand, he held one of the leather journals from the dipping shelf. The one Lokesh had noticed was missing its layer of dust. Once, Hridaya arrived as the morning mist peeled away from the river, her movements possessing the slow gravity of a clock pendulum. She merged into the courtyard, her analog Leica cradled against her chest like a sleeping bird. Lokesh watched from the porch, noting the rhythmic, meditative click-click-click of her rotating the lens dials, a sound that seemed to synchronize with the distant tolling of a temple bell. She didn't greet him. Instead, she pointed toward the eastern wall, where the first shard of sunlight sliced through the lime-plastered gloom. "The light is migrating," Hridaya whispered. "It doesn't just fall, it travels. I want to document the transit. I want to see where the house breathes in the sun." Lokesh felt the familiar itch of a problem needing a solution. He produced a brass compass and a weathered moleskine notebook, the pages stiff with structural sketches. "If we want to track the migration, we should establish a grid," Lokesh said, his voice carrying the momentum of a man who feared being late to a meeting. "I can calculate the solar azimuth and angle of incidence. If I map the coordinates of the shadow's edge every 15 minutes, we can create a precise chronological record. It would be a perfect dataset for the house's spatial orientation." He began to pace, the compass needle dancing. He was already imagining the graph, a clean, parabolic curve of light moving across the weathered ochre of the walls. The numbers felt like armor, shielding him from the oppressive silence of the ancestral home. Hridaya didn't argue. She stepped into his path and, with a fluid gesture, took the notebook from his hand. Lokesh froze, his hand still curled in the shape of the book, his glasses sliding down the bridge of his nose. "Stop documenting," she said softly, her gaze fixed on the wall. "You are treating the light like a trespasser you need to categorize. Stop trying to solve the morning, Lokesh. Just exist in it." She didn't return the book. Instead, she leaned against a carved sandalwood pillar and closed her eyes. Lokesh stood feeling the raw exposure of having no plan. For several minutes, the silence was a contest of wills, his drive to organize versus her effortless stillness. He wanted to explain that precision was the only way to truly understand a thing, but the peace on Hridaya's face acted as a physical barrier. He let his hand drop, his fingers still twitching for the pen. They spent the next few hours in suspended animation on the cool stone floor of the veranda. Lokesh watched the shadow of the central pillar, a thick, dark finger of shade creeping across the floor with glacial slowness. At first, the pace was intolerable. His mind leapt forward, calculating the velocity of the sun's transit. He felt a restlessness in his marrow, a phantom vibration of the city life he had left behind, where time was a currency to be spent and saved. But as the hours bled together, the restlessness shifted. He stopped measuring. He began to notice the texture of the silence, not as a void, but as a composition. The muffled cry of a street vendor, the rhythmic slap of laundry against the gats, the low hum of a city that felt miles away. He noticed a shimmering, liquid pattern dancing on the ceiling, a reflection of the Ganges bouncing off a mirrored surface. It was a pale, undulating gold, a ghostly ribbon of light. For the first time in a decade, Lokesh felt a sensation of timelessness. It was a vertigo of the soul, a feeling that the walls weren't just stone and mortar, but a vessel for something that defied the laws of a stopwatch. It terrified him, the idea that he could disappear into a moment without a record of it, and yet it thrilled him. He felt as though he were shedding a skin that had been too tight, his breathing slowed, syncing with the pulse of the house. He didn't notice when Hridaya shifted. He didn't hear the subtle click of the shutter. He was staring at the golden ribbon on the ceiling, his expression vacant of tension, his shoulders finally dropping. He looked, for the first time since arriving in Varanasi, like a man who was actually home. Hridaya lowered the camera, a knowing smile touching her lips. She studied the image in her mind. The structural engineer caught in genuine repose, stripped of his blueprints. She didn't tell him she had taken the photo. Some things, she believed, lost their truth the moment they were acknowledged. Lokesh blinked, the spell breaking as he glanced at his wrist. He stared at his watch, then at the sun, then back at the watch. He realized with a jolt of shock that he hadn't checked the time in 6 hours. The panic that usually accompanied such a lapse, the fear of inefficiency, was strangely absent. In its place was a hollow, humming quiet. "You look different," Hridaya remarked. She began to pack her gear, her movements now tinged with urgency. "I feel light," Lokesh admitted, his voice sounding foreign, softer. "I didn't realize how much energy I spent just keeping track of the seconds." Hridaya paused, her hand on the leather strap of her camera. She looked toward the street, where the distant sound of drums and celebratory horns signaled the approach of the festival. The air was thickening with the scent of incense and frying sweets. "Enjoy this stillness, Lokesh," she cautioned. "The festival will bring a noise that doesn't just fill the ears, but fills the mind. It will be a storm of color and sound. I wonder if this piece you've found is a foundation, or if it's just a thin layer of dust that the first wind will blow away." Lokesh watched her walk away, her silhouette blending into the silver-gold haze of the afternoon. He studied the shadow of the pillar, which had finally reached the edge of the porch. He felt the fragility she spoke of, a sudden tremor of doubt. He reached into his pocket and felt the cold, hard edge of the lotus-shaped key. He wondered if the piece he had found in the silence was a gift from the house, or a trap designed to make him vulnerable to the chaos about to arrive. The lime-plastered arch. The lime paste was the color of a clouded moon and smelled of wet stone. It sat in a wide wooden trough, thick and temperamental, resisting the trowel with a stubborn, viscous pull. Lokesh stood before the courtyard archway, a jagged gap of exposed brick and crumbling mortar that needed to be sealed before the festival of Dev Deepawali turned the city into a river of light and noise. Wahid Qureshi stood beside him, his movements economical. The mason didn't just apply the plaster, he coaxed it. He worked in a slow, rhythmic arc, his wrist rotating with a precision born of decades of muscle memory. "The lime is alive, Lokesh," Wahid said, his voice a rough hum. "If you fight it, it will leave a scar. If you rush it, it will crack. You must wait for the wall to tell you it is ready." Lokesh nodded, but his mind raced toward the calendar. He felt the phantom pressure of a deadline, the imagined ticking of a clock that didn't exist in this courtyard. Outside, the city was accelerating. He could hear the erratic beat of dole drums and the sharp clang of temple bells. The air thickened with the scent of frying jalebis and the floral musk of marigolds. Every sound felt like a reminder of time slipping away, a leak in a pipe he couldn't shut. He dipped his trowel and swung it toward the arch. His movement was sharp, a clinical strike intended to cover as much surface as possible. The plaster didn't flow, it slumped. A heavy, wet streak tore through the smooth surface Wahid had established, leaving a jagged valley of excess lime. Lokesh froze, his thumb rubbing against his index finger in a rapid, rhythmic motion. The familiar spike of anxiety hit him, the urge to scrape it all off, to apply a chemical accelerant that would force the material to set in minutes. "Too fast," Wahid murmured, observing the mistake as if it were a weather pattern. "You are treating the wall like a problem to be solved. It is a conversation." Lokesh stepped back, his breath coming in shallow bursts. He watched the streak, then looked toward the horizon where the first flickers of diyas were igniting on the ghats like 1,000 grounded stars. The festival noise was no longer a hum. It was a tide rising to swallow the silence he had cultivated. He felt the fragility Hridaya had warned him about, the sense that his piece was a thin layer of dust and the wind had finally arrived. But as he stared at the wet lime, he remembered the silk threads in Uncle Omkar's weaving room, and the way the loom demanded a surrender of the ego. He closed his eyes and forced a long, slow breath into his lungs, holding it until his chest felt tight, then letting it out with a hiss. He dropped his shoulders, imagining the tension sinking into the cool earth of the courtyard. He opened his eyes. The world had slowed. The distant drums were no longer a countdown, they were a heartbeat. Lokesh stepped forward, not to finish, but to be present. He applied the lime with a deliberate, sweeping motion, mirroring the arc of Wahid's wrist. He ignored the whole arch, focusing only on the 3 inches of stone directly in front of him. He felt the resistance of the paste and adjusted his pressure by a fraction of a millimeter, allowing the material to settle into the grain of the wall. Wahid stopped and watched. For several minutes, the only sound was the wet, rhythmic schluck-schluck of the trowels. The synchronization was gradual, a blending of the engineer's precision and the mason's intuition. They worked in a shared silence, their breaths falling into a matched cadence, bound together by the white, lunar mud of the ancestral home. As the sun dipped below the skyline, casting a deep violet hue over the city, they stepped back. The archway was complete. It wasn't a sterile, mathematically perfect line. There were slight undulations, a hand-hewn quality that caught the fading light. It was a masterpiece of perfect imperfection, structurally sound, yet organic enough to belong to the earth. Lokesh looked at his hands, coated in drying lime. He didn't feel the urge to wash them. He felt a strange solidity, as if the act of slowing down had anchored him. He wasn't just repairing a house, he was repairing the fractured rhythm of his own life. Wahid placed a heavy, calloused hand on Lokesh's shoulder. "You stopped fighting the house," Wahid said. "A visitor tries to fix things to make them fit his map. A steward listens to the house and changes his map to fit the truth. You are no longer a visitor here, Lokesh. You are a steward." Lokesh felt a lump in his throat. He looked out toward the street where the festival had exploded into life, a kaleidoscope of shouts, laughter, and the smell of 1,000 oil lamps. The chaos was there, but it no longer felt like a threat. He reached into his pocket and touched the lotus-shaped key, its cold metal warm against his skin. He thought of the hidden chamber and the non-Euclidean map. He realized the house would never be fully finished because a living thing only evolves. As they cleaned their tools, Uncle Omkar appeared with a tray of steaming masala chai, the scent of cinnamon and ginger cutting through the lime. He studied the arch, his eyes twinkling. "The light is reaching the water," Omkar observed, gesturing toward the river. "The city is waking up for the gods." Lokesh smiled, a genuine warmth spreading through his chest. He turned to Wahid, wanting to express a gratitude too large for words. But before he could speak, a temple horn blasted, long and low, signaling the start of the evening's main procession. "Lokesh," Omkar said, his voice suddenly taking on a weight that stopped the engineer mid-breath. "There is something in the library that only the lotus key can open, and I believe the house is tired of keeping the secret." The 1,000 lamp glow. The river had ceased to be water and had become a mirror for a fallen sky. Thousands of diya lamps, small terracotta cups of flickering oil, lined the stone ghats in undulating ribbons of gold, blurring the boundary between the granite steps and the dark current of the Ganges. Lokesh moved through the press of the crowd, the air thick with the scent of burning camphor, crushed marigolds, and the damp mineral breath of the river mist. Usually, this density of humanity, the sudden erratic brush of shoulders, the overlapping shouts of pilgrims, the shrill whistle of a distant boat, would have triggered a tightening in his chest, a frantic mental calculation of exit routes and personal space. Now, however, he felt as though he were walking through a layer of warm silk. There was a buffer of internal silence, a quietude he had learned from the loom and the lime plaster that kept the chaos at a distance. He stepped over a puddle reflecting a single, trembling flame, and saw Hridaya. She was standing on a wide plateau of stone, her analog camera held habitually to her eye, framing the horizon where the lights of the city met the obsidianness of the water. She looked like a statue of observation, a woman who lived her life as a curator of moments rather than a participant in them. Lokesh slowed his pace, watching the way she adjusted the aperture dial with a precise mechanical flick of her finger. For a moment, he wondered if she would ever truly step into the frame she was so obsessed with capturing. Then, Hridaya did something that made Lokesh stop in his tracks. With a slow, deliberate motion, she lowered the camera. She didn't check the film counter or wipe the lens. She simply leaned down and placed the heavy metal body of the camera on a cold stone step, leaving it exposed and unattended in the middle of the throng. She stood up, her shoulders dropping an inch, and looked out at the river with an expression of raw, unmediated presence. She wasn't documenting the light, she was letting the light dissolve her. Lokesh felt a strange vibration in his own throat, a realization that the most profound act of courage in a world of precision was the act of putting down the tool. He left Hridaya to her silence and continued toward the water's edge, his feet finding a rhythm that mirrored the slow pulse of the city. He found Tripti where the crowd thinned, standing at the very lip of the ghat. She was draped in a saree the color of a bruised plum, the fabric shimmering under the amber glow of the lamps. As he approached, she didn't turn immediately, but he saw her head tilt slightly, her ears catching the cadence of his stride. When she finally looked at him, the light of 1,000 diyas reflected in her pupils like distant, dying stars. The gold didn't just illuminate her, it seemed to emanate from her, a softness that made the hard stone of the ghat feel like velvet. They stood together in a silence that felt heavy, not with tension, but with a shared weight of understanding. The air between them smelled of river salt and the sweet, cloying smoke of incense. Lokesh found himself noticing the small things, the way a stray thread of silver zari clung to her shoulder, the rhythmic rise and fall of her chest, the distant, low hum of a temple bell that seemed to vibrate in the marrow of his bones. For the first time in a decade, the mental architecture of his life, the Gants, the deadlines, the structural load calculations, collapsed. He wasn't thinking about the return flight to the city, the emails piling up in a digital void, or the rigid blueprints of a career built on the avoidance of failure. Tripti shifted her weight, her gaze returning to the river. She didn't speak, but she reached out and slid her hand into his. Lokesh felt the contact as a physical shock, a sudden grounding that felt more permanent than any reinforced concrete beam he had ever designed. Her palm was warm, her skin slightly calloused from the tension of the loom, and the grip was light, yet it anchored him to the earth with an absolute authority. He didn't squeeze back immediately, he simply let the sensation register, a sensory zoom that narrowed the entire universe down to the point where their skin met. He could feel the minute pulse in her wrist, the slight tremor of the cold river breeze against her fingers, and the overwhelming sense of arrival. He wasn't just in Varanasi, he was home. Not the home of a deed or a family name, but a home found in the stillness between two heartbeats. "You're not calculating the distance to the airport," Tripti said, her voice a melodic, airy whisper that barely rose above the sound of the water. Lokesh let out a breath he felt he had been holding since he first stepped off the plane weeks ago. He rubbed his thumb against his index finger, a habit of anxiety that had finally ceased to be a reflex. "I can't remember why I ever cared about the distance," he replied, his voice sounding foreign to his own ears, softer, slower, stripped of the professional armor he usually wore. They watched a small leaf boat, carrying a single lamp, drift away from the shore and merge into the golden river of light. The spectacle was hypnotic, a slow-motion dissolution of the individual into the infinite. Lokesh realized that his desire for precision had been a shield against the fear of being lost. But standing here, with the scent of camphor clinging to his clothes and Tripti's hand in his, being lost felt like the only way to be found. The house, the map, the lotus key, they were all markers leading to the specific, unplannable moment of surrender. Tripti turned her face toward him, the amber light carving the delicate lines of her profile. She didn't let go of his hand, but she tightened her grip slightly, a silent signal that the moment of peace was about to be punctuated by a truth. The serenity of the evening remained, but a new current of tension entered the space between them, a question that had been hovering in the air since the first day he had tried to impose a timeline on the restoration of the house. "Lokesh," she whispered, her eyes searching his, "the festival ends and the lamps eventually burn out. When the gold fades and the city returns to its gray morning, which version of yourself will you be taking back with you?" The question hit him with the force of a structural failure. It wasn't a question of logistics, but of identity. He studied the river, then back at the woman whose presence had become the center of his gravity. He thought of the sterile, glass-walled office waiting for him in the metropolis, and then he thought of the smell of sandalwood in the chamber of stillness and the rhythmic, meditative clack of the loom. The choice wasn't between two cities, but between two different ways of existing, one that measured life in increments of efficiency, and one that measured it in the depth of a single shared breath. He opened his mouth to answer, but the words felt too small for the weight of the moment. Just as he began to speak, a sudden, loud crash echoed from the direction of the upper Ghats, the sound of something heavy and stone shattering against the riverbank. The crowd gasped, the collective breath of 1,000 people hitching at once. Lokesh didn't let go of Tripti's hand, but he turned his head toward the sound, a flicker of the old engineer returning to assess the damage, while the man he had become remained rooted in the warmth of the glow. The river's steady flow. The roar of the upper Ghats remained behind him, a distant, jagged memory as Lokesh walked back toward the ancestral home. He didn't run toward the crash, and he didn't calculate the probable failure of the masonry or the tonnage of the fallen stone. Instead, he walked with a deliberate, heavy-footed, slow pace, feeling the grit of the Varanasi dust beneath his sandals and the lingering warmth of Tripti's hand on his skin. The festival's cacophony, the chanting, the bells, the collective gasp of the crowd, began to peel away, replaced by the humming silence of the narrow lanes. By the time he crossed the threshold of the house, the air had shifted. The noise of the city was no longer a pressure against his eardrums, but a soft, blurred backdrop to the sanctuary of the courtyard. He didn't stop to check the mail or glance at the blueprints scattered across the dining table. He moved straight to the chamber of stillness. The door groaned with a familiar, welcoming weight, and as he stepped inside, the scent of sandalwood hit him not as a fragrance, but as a physical embrace. It had seeped into the fibers of his linen shirt and the pores of his skin, a pine-rich, ancient smell that felt less like a perfume and more like a homecoming. He sat on the floor, his back against the cool, lime-plastered wall, and let his legs stretch out across the stone. The room was dim, lit only by the sliver of moonlight cutting through the high ventilator, carving a single, silver path across the floor. Lokesh reached for his wrist, a reflex born of a decade of deadlines. He watched the face of his watch, a precision instrument of brushed steel and sapphire crystal. The second hand was frozen, a thin sliver of red suspended between two ticks. He remembered winding it the night before, but now the mechanism had simply surrendered. In the metropolis, a stopped watch was a crisis, a loss of synchronization with the world's machinery. Here, in the heavy silence of the sandalwood room, he studied the dead dial and felt a sudden, sharp surge of indifference. He didn't reach for the crown to wind it. He simply let his arm drop, the watch clicking softly against the stone floor, an obsolete piece of jewelry in a room that measured time by the slow accumulation of dust and the deepening of shadows. For a long time he stayed there, listening to the house breathe. He considered the non-Euclidean map he had found, and the lotus key resting in his pocket. For weeks he had viewed them as puzzles to be solved, structural anomalies that required a technical explanation. Now, they felt like metaphors. He realized that he had spent his entire adult life trying to build walls that would never crack and bridges that would never sway, treating the world as a series of vulnerabilities to be mitigated. He had lived in a state of constant, low-level tension, a structural strain that had left him brittle. He had been a man of knots, tight, anxious loops of obligation and efficiency that bound his chest so tightly he had forgotten how to take a full breath. "The tea is still hot," a voice hummed, deep and resonant, vibrating through the quiet of the room. Lokesh didn't startle. He opened his eyes to see Omkar standing in the doorway, holding a small brass tray with 2 steaming glasses of masala chai. The steam rose in lazy, curling ribbons, illuminated by the moonlight. Omkar didn't ask about the crash at the Ghats or the interrupted conversation with Tripti. He simply stepped inside and sat beside his nephew, his movements slow and deliberate, as if he were moving through water. He placed the tea between them, the scent of ginger and cardamom cutting through the heavy sandalwood. Omkar didn't speak for several minutes. He rested his hands flat on his thighs, his gaze fixed on the silver sliver of light on the floor. Lokesh watched his uncle's slow blinking, the rhythmic, meditative quality of his presence. In the silence there was a mutual recognition, a silent bridge built between the engineer and the weaver. Omkar wasn't looking at the man who had arrived with a clipboard and a timeline. He was looking at the man who had finally stopped fighting the current. Lokesh felt a strange, fluttering lightness in his chest, a loosening of the knots he had carried across the ocean. He realized that the restoration of the house, the scrubbing of the walls, the fixing of the beams, the discovery of hidden rooms, had been a mirror. He hadn't been repairing a building. He had been repairing the architecture of his own spirit. "I used to think that if I could just map everything," Lokesh said, his voice soft, the pauses between his words longer than they used to be, "I could prevent the collapse. I thought precision was the only way to be safe." Omkar took a slow sip of the chai, the glass clinking softly. "The river doesn't have a map, Lokesh. It only has a direction. The stone that resists the water eventually breaks. The water that flows around the stone eventually reaches the sea." He turned his head slightly, a small, knowing smile touching the corners of his eyes. "You have stopped resisting. I can hear it in your breathing." Lokesh looked down at his hands, the rhythmic rubbing of his thumb against his index finger. The nervous tick that had accompanied him through every boardroom presentation and site inspection had stopped. His hands were still. He felt a profound sense of fluidity, a realization that his identity wasn't a fixed blueprint, but a piece of cloth still on the loom, being woven thread by thread, moment by moment. The fear of being lost, which had haunted him on the riverbank with Tripti, had vanished. Being lost was not a failure of navigation, it was the prerequisite for discovery. He rose slowly and stepped out of the chamber, followed by Omkar. They walked together into the central courtyard, where the air was cool and smelled of damp earth and night-bloom scent. From this distance, the Ganges was an invisible presence, but its voice was everywhere, a steady, eternal thrum that vibrated in the soles of his feet. It was the heartbeat of the city, a constant, undulating reminder that everything flows, everything changes, and everything eventually returns to the source. Lokesh leaned against a pillar of carved teak, closing his eyes. He listened to the distant, rhythmic clack, clack, clack of the looms from the neighboring houses, the sound merging with the distant murmur of the river. He felt his own heart beating in synchronization with that rhythm, a slow, steady pulse that matched the pace of the weaving. He thought of the glass towers of the metropolis, the sterile air conditioning, the ticking clocks, and the endless pursuit of a perfection that didn't exist. It felt like a dream he had had a long time ago, a story about a different man. He stayed there in the moonlight, suspended between the man he was and the man he was becoming. The ambiguity of his future, the question of whether he would return to his old life or stay in the saffron stillness of Varanasi, no longer felt like a problem to be solved. It felt like a thread, waiting to be woven into a larger pattern. He didn't need an answer tonight, he only needed the silence and the scent of the river. As he turned to head back inside, Omkar stopped him, his voice dropping to a low, curious frequency. "The lotus key, Lokesh. Did you find the locket belongs to, or is it still waiting for you to ask it the right question?"